Let's go with these. The connective tissue covering that surrounds the cell membrane of an individual muscle fiber, that would be called the endomysium. I think most people got that one. Endomysium. Number 2, the function of T-tubules in muscle contraction is to, correct answer is C, transmit the electrical muscle impulse deep into the muscle cell. So D, C. D, C. We had a few people that struggled with that one. Number 3, during muscle contraction, cross bridges of myosin filaments form linkages with, the correct answer is A, actin. It's all about actin and myosin. Actin and myosin. Sarah played the role of actin. Colin, you were myosin. Hopefully you got that right.
No.
After
I was
playing,
confused because I thought
wow.
it was asking for the person to move.
To be honest with you, like, that scenario really helped me.
Good, good. Well, you know, it's active learning. When you do anything active, whether you go up to the board or you participate in a human dramatization, that's considered active learning. And it does tend to stick.
I just couldn't remember if Ebony was tropomyosin or
I know, I feel like I
hormone.
always mix them up.
She was
Wait, who was?
Ebony.
Ebony was your mother? Oh,
Yeah.
Dad. That was Dad.
No,
Abby was
Who
dad.
my mother?
Wait, you were, no, you were the mother.
No, she was the dad.
You were the dad, so you were standing in front.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were tropomyosin.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah. Okay, number 5. Prior to muscle contraction, calcium ions are released from, the correct answer is B, terminal cisternae. Number 6. Which of the following proteins cover the active binding sites? We just said that. That would be C, tropomyosin. Number 7. All of the following are true with regard to muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells, except B, innervated by somatic motor fibers. Somatic motor fibers innervate skeletal muscle. Number 8, troponin has binding sites for all the following except for, the correct answer is myosin. It has binding sites for actin at one side, tropomyosin at the other, and in the center, calcium. Number 9, contraction of the biceps produces flexion of the forearm at the elbow. The attachment to the radial tuberosity would be referred to as its C insertion. That's the bone that moves. Number 10, the long, cylindrical, rod-like contractile elements which are densely packed within a muscle fiber are called, correct answer is C, myofibrils. List 5 characteristics of skeletal muscle. You could say that it's cylindrical in shape. You could say that it's striated, that it has multiple peripheral nuclei, that it's under voluntary control, that it attaches to bone, that it's innervated by somatic nerve fibers, that it possesses nicotinic M receptors. There's a lot of things you could put. We just needed 5 of them. We just needed 5. Okay? If you went off and you put 10 things down, I'll only accept 5. How'd y'all do?
Yeah, me too.
Pretty good.
Pretty much.
Did pretty well? Good.
I'm telling you, that one scenario helped me answer those 3 questions.
I'm glad to hear that.
Even though I studied, like, just the...
You see that, Jake? Okay.
I was-
Just making sure I wasn't the only one.
I'm glad you got it, Sarah.
That's one person.
First, I got like one question right.
Maybe not in this
Of course,
class.
you know, 'cause
You know, for some of you, and I'm not going to mention names, you need to improve your quiz accuracy. For some of you, doing better on the quizzes was extremely important. I'm not going to mention names.
Like, all of us.
All of us.
Right.
Everyone except Abby.
No, I would use it.
He said some of us need to do extremely better on our quizzes.
Yeah, I would.
All right.
Yeah, okay.
Now, let's finish up that last PowerPoint so we can start talking about individual muscles. We can differentiate between isotonic contractions and isometric. Isotonic contractions are those in which a load is moved. Okay? The muscle changes in length and the load is moved. In other words, there's a change in the angle of the joint. If I pick up this model here, like this, there's movement here. There's a change in the angle of the elbow joint. That's an isotonic contraction. In isometric contraction, tension increases to the muscle's capacity, but the muscle neither shortens nor lengthens. There's no movement. So watch this. Isometric contraction. Okay? Let me do this. Okay? Now, isometric contractions occur if the load is greater than the tension that the muscle is able to develop. So you've heard about isotonic or isometric exercises. Now, in order to contract, muscle requires ATP. Most muscles have enough ATP available within them to power them for about 4 to 6 seconds. Okay? Here's what happens. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine to which 3 phosphate groups are attached.
Gee,
And the last 2 bonds
tell me to put
here are drawn with a little curvilinear line. It indicates that these are high energy bonds. Really what a high energy bond means is that if it's broken, that's number one, it's easily broken, and when it's broken it releases energy that the cell can use to produce work. So high energy bonds are really bonds that are simply easily broken. Now, if you break this bond between the second and third phosphate group, then ATP, because that's what this is, ATP, then you're converting ATP into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus a phosphate group, an organic phosphate. So a muscle has enough ATP available to produce 4 to 6 seconds of energy simply by breaking these bonds. Now, once a muscle uses up that energy, it's stored ATP, then it's got to either regenerate ATP or it's got to begin to produce ATP in order to continue to contract. Now, one way in which ATP can be regenerated is through an interaction with a molecule inside the cell called creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate is composed of a molecule called creatine, to which is attached a phosphate group. But notice the bond between phosphate and creatine is a high energy bond. It's easily broken and can provide energy. So this phosphate group from creatine can be transferred to adenosine diphosphate to regenerate ATP.
So that's why people take creatine for workouts sometimes?
Right. So here's creatine phosphate. It can react with ADP, transferring its high energy bond, forming ATP and creatine. So that's one way of regenerating ATP. The other way in which you can generate ATP is through glycolysis, taking glucose and breaking it down anaerobically without oxygen, and through aerobic respiration, where we break down glucose with the use of oxygen through the Krebs cycle. Now, this type of reaction, where the phosphate group from creatine phosphate is simply transferred to ADP, this is referred to as substrate level phosphorylation. Substrate level phosphorylation. Okay? And this can continue to power the muscle for up to 15 seconds. So, for instance, if you're running the 100-yard dash, like some of you may have done in high school, well, you have enough stored energy in the form of ATP and creatine phosphate to power that 100-yard dash. Because again, the stores of creatine phosphate will last an additional 15 seconds. Now, what about if you need more energy? Well, one way of developing or generating ATP is through glycolysis. Okay, glycolysis, remember, is that series of reactions in which you break down glucose with a series of perhaps about 10 steps, and it's converted to pyruvate. In fact, one glucose is converted into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. Each pyruvate has 3 carbons. This glycolytic pathway, remember, occurs within the sarcoplasm, and it does not require oxygen. No oxygen is required. Okay? It generates only, though, about 2 molecules of ATP per glucose molecule. Okay? So it's not terribly efficient or effective. Okay? But if a cell is lacking in energy, it can take some of that glycogen that it's stored, break it down into glucose, and begin utilizing that glucose as a fuel to generate ATP. Okay? And glycolysis can power a muscle for about 30 to 60 seconds. Okay? Now, if you continue to go without oxygen, now what happens? Without oxygen, pyruvate can't be transferred into the mitochondria and participate in the Krebs cycle. Without oxygen, this pyruvate is going to build up. And as it builds up, it's converted to lactic acid. And that lactic acid contributes to muscle fatigue. Whereas if oxygen is available, the pyruvate can be shunted into the Krebs cycle where more energy can be created, more ATP can be formed. Okay? So in the presence of oxygen, pyruvate can be shunted into the Krebs cycle. It won't be converted to lactic acid. Remember, the enzymes in the Krebs cycle are present within mitochondria. Okay? Within this inner cell membrane. The problem with the Krebs cycle is that it requires oxygen. But in the presence of oxygen, pyruvate gets shunted in, it's converted to acetyl-coenzyme A. And acetyl-coenzyme A is going to join that cycle of chemical reactions, which generates about 36 molecules of ATP per initial glucose. So again, in the presence of oxygen, the cell is much more efficient. It generates a lot more ATP. And because this is so efficient, as long as oxygen is being supplied, then the muscle can be powered for hours. Okay? So if you're running a marathon, you know, as long as you're not utilizing maximal power, okay, the muscles can continue to produce ATP. Now, the problem is when you begin to put forth near maximal effort. When you reach about 70% or more of maximal muscle capacity. Okay? Then what happens is the need for oxygen begins to outstrip the supply. And then, instead of being able to carry out aerobic metabolism, you switch to anaerobic. And you begin to build up lactic acid. Okay? And so that's going to contribute to muscle fatigue. Okay? So when you are utilizing near maximal muscle activity, then what happens is demand begins to outstrip supply. You can no longer rely on the Krebs cycle, and then muscles are going to begin to fatigue. Again, due to buildup of lactic acid. Now, if you're running a marathon where you may be operating at 40 to 50%, there's no need to worry. Okay? It's only when contractile activity reaches about 70% of maximum. If you ever notice if you ever go to the gym, how many people here go to the gym? You know, and you see a lot of people doing a lot of powerlifting. They're trying to maximize the number of reps. You know, in a pretty heavy set. They might be doing bench presses. And then they may reach 10, 11, and then they struggle to get that 12th one up. But what happens? The muscles begin to fatigue. Okay? If these individuals look at themselves in the mirror, and there are mirrors all around the gym, okay, they start to admire themselves. Why? Because as they're working out, the muscles begin to swell, right? And as the muscles begin to bulge, they compress the blood vessels that are delivering oxygen. Okay, so oxygen delivery becomes impaired. Demand outstrips supply. Okay? And so without being able to carry out aerobic metabolism, they're dependent upon glycolysis. And so over the course of a short period of time, pyruvic acid builds up, it gets converted to lactic acid, and muscle fatigue begins to set in. Now, that lactic acid will ultimately diffuse from the cell into the extracellular fluid. In fact, it can be carried by the bloodstream to other organs. It can be picked up by the liver, kidneys, heart, and can be converted back to pyruvic acid. And that requires a little bit of energy. Over time, so a muscle fatigues. Muscle fatigue is the state in which it's physiologically unable to contract. Okay? It occurs when ATP production fails to keep pace with ATP use. So you develop a relative deficiency of ATP. Remember, without ADP, the myosin heads can't detach. You start to develop muscle contractures. Lactic acid accumulates, begins to contribute to fatigue. You even develop some ionic imbalances, as Jordan suggested.
When did I suggest that?
I thought you suggested it last class.
Oh, okay, yeah, I did. Okay, I thought you meant like today.
So there are some changes that occur with the muscle chemistry. You deplete the glycogen, okay? You use up all of the oxygen that's bound to myoglobin. There are some electrolyte imbalances that are created. Lactic acid begins to build up. We say that the cell develops an oxygen debt, okay? The debt that the cell develops, or that the muscle develops, is the extra amount of oxygen needed to restore the original resting conditions. Okay? In other words, the oxygen reserves, the oxygen that was bound to myoglobin, has to be replaced. Lactic acid has to be converted back to pyruvic acid. Okay? That takes energy. That requires oxygen. Glycogen stores must be replaced. And then finally, ATP and creatine phosphate reserves have to be resynthesized. So the amount of oxygen it takes to restore